Marketing is everything. Don't judge a book by its cover may be one of the most pointless sayings ever, because everyone does, all the time. We judge books by their cover, people at first glances, and movies within 3 seconds of a trailer. Marketing is everything. The movie industry spends millions on it every year in the hopes to get your sweaty little bum in the air-conditioned cinema. And yet, time and time again, the marketing harms the product. Sometimes they give too much information away, or refuse to market musicals as musicals, and sometimes they just lie. However, one film always stands out to me when discussing bad marketing so poorly thought through that even the director himself spoke out against it. This film is Crimson Peak, and this is when marketing ruins a movie. For those of you who don't know, Crimson Peak was released in 2015 and is a gothic romance directed by Del Toro, the same magical man behind the wonderfully dark Pan's Labyrinth. The story follows Edith, a young American girl who dreams of becoming a writer, who quickly finds herself in a whirlwind romance with a handsome Englishman named Thomas Sharp. Quickly they are married and she moves to Britain to live with Thomas and his sister Lucille in their old rundown mansion. However, something sinister lurks in the shadows, and the house begins to reveal its secrets to Edith in the form of recordings, letters, and ghosts.
Ghosts are real. This much I know.
If there is one thing you should know about me, it's that I love Crimson Peak, and I would go as far as saying it's one of my favourite films ever. I know that might sound nuts to some, but bear with me. I adore this film. I have the making of book, I have framed pictures, I listen to the soundtrack when writing all the time, and I will force a friend to watch it and love it at least once a year. I just find this film so entrancing. Whenever it's on, I'm hooked almost immediately, like I was the first time I watched it in the cinema. The colours just pop off the screen, the set design is magical, the costumes are so beautifully crafted, and the performances are so heightened to fit the style of the piece. I usually adore anything gothic, and I think it's great that we're beginning to see a comeback of the genre in recent years. And although the term love letter is very overused, Crimson Peak really is a love letter to the gothic romance genre, full of melodrama and lavish spectacle. It's like a Jane Austen novel with added blood and death and arse crack. It's an exploration into love and the dark side of infatuation. It has all the story beats of an old Hollywood romance, yet twists it into something darker and seedier. For me, it's one of the most visually striking genre pieces of the last 10 years. And audiences hated it. This film massively underperformed at the box office. Audience reviews were middling to say the least, and most people have probably forgotten this film even exists. Critics were slightly kinder to it, although many still had their issues. It only has a 6 out of 10 on IMDb, which I'm sorry, that's fucking sacrilege, and I remember so many of my friends at the time going to see it and leaving bitterly disappointed. And although some people had problems with the plot or the pacing, there was one criticism that came up time and time again. It's not scary. And I mean constantly. This was the major thing that people couldn't stop talking about. Where were the scares? Where was the full-on terror? I wanted to throw up in fright. I wanted to never sleep again. And although that all sounds like a cry for help, I can't blame them for feeling disappointed. Crimson Peak was marketed like a horror. The trailers heavily featured the ghosts and the spooks rather than the dark romance that takes up the majority of the film. Even the music is far from the tone of the movie, using it for cheap jump scares which there are very little of in the actual cut. The trailer hints at romance, but barely. You'd be forgiven for thinking that it's only there at the beginning of the movie until the scares begin. And all the scary bits, if you want to call them that, are basically in the trailer, because that's not what the film's about. It doesn't want to terrify you, not in that way at least. Now this film was released in October, which is obviously the month of Halloween, and the marketing really played into that. Now I've always thought this was the wrong month to release it. Ghosts in October is always going to make an audience think it's scary, even if you cut a more honest trailer. Instead, I think late November would have been a better time. One, there's a lot of snow in the film, but also it has a romance and it's dark and it feels incredibly grand, and that would have offered something unique against all the twee, vomit-inducing kindness that a lot of Christmas movies have. But they didn't do that. So with a Halloween release and the trailer, horror audiences turned up while the actual intended audience stayed far away, and the horror audience felt cheated. They didn't see it as a rich gothic romance, they saw it as a bad horror film. And suddenly it wasn't just the scares that were being picked apart, but the plot, with many calling it predictable and old-fashioned. However, that was kind of the point. Gothic romance is a very different beast to gothic horror. It has a long, rich history and usually involves incredibly similar beats. A young woman, 2 men dying for her attention, one very good, one dark and mysterious, and a possible haunting. It's all there. And like I said, this is a love letter to that. It's not trying to reinvent the genre, but just offer a new version for modern day audiences.
Beware of Crimson Peak.
Where horror uses its ghosts to create scares, gothic romance uses the supernatural to create atmosphere and mystery. The odd fright may still be there, but there's usually something else thematically behind them than just a way of making your viewers scream. This genre doesn't usually have big scares, with its tension being more rooted in suspense and a chilling atmosphere. Crimson Peak explores themes such as love and obsession and sex and murder. And although these are elements that you will find in horror, definitely slasher films, it's executed very differently, rooting its themes more in character. Also, just the style is a completely different thing to what most horror fans are wanting. For all the absurdity of horror, it's usually rooted in a naturalistic setting or style, with actors trying their hardest to make their characters feel as real as possible. Gothic romance, on the other hand, is much more heightened in every aspect, with performances usually drifting into a more theatrical style.
The horror was for love.
Crimson Peak isn't for Insidious or Conjuring fans, but it's for fans of Rebecca and Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. And that audience isn't going to go to something that's promoted as being scary, or something that Stephen King called fucking terrifying. Yeah, let's talk about Stephen King. Stephen King fucked this movie. He royally fucked it with 2 words. Stephen King is known to many as the master of horror. He has written some of the most well-known horror books, with many being turned into films, some being good, some being dreadful, but they usually always attract a large crowd to the cinema. Due to this, people will take his opinion on horror as gospel. Now, I don't know why he felt this way, but after watching Crimson Peak, he described it as fucking terrifying, unfortunately sealing the movie's fate as a scary, scary horror. Now, there are 2 problems with this. 1, horror is subjective. You can't take anyone's word as gospel when it comes to scares, because what gives them bad dreams may have you sleeping like a baby. Some people are scared of spiders and some aren't. I would fucking dropkick anyone who brought a snake near me, and others would just stroke the snake. I have ADHD and dyslexia. My biggest fear is a spreadsheet. People are different. But secondly, this quote, alongside the trailer and the October release, make it impossible to see it as anything else than your basic horror fest of the year.
It's all a game to you!
Now, 100%, if Stephen King calls your movie fucking terrifying, you're going to use that quote. I get that, you'd be a bit thick not to. But it should be used in a way to tempt your secondary audience to come and see it, and those are the horror fans. This quote, with a more accurate marketing campaign, would actually do wonders, suddenly broadening your intended audience without disappointing as many people. And Del Toro himself knows this. He wasn't happy with how the film was advertised either. At the beginning of its release, Del Toro tweeted, "Crimson Peak, not a horror film, a gothic romance." And then years later in an interview, he would go on to say, "I remember distinctly, when we had the meetings about promotion, they all were targeted towards getting the horror audience for the opening weekend. And I knew we were doomed." And I find it insane that they got it so wrong when the film literally beats you over the head with it.
More story with the ghost in it. The ghost is just a metaphor.
Ghosts.
Well, the ghosts are just a metaphor, really.
They've always
There's nothing-
fascinated me.
It's the one part of the film that I think is too heavy-handed, but maybe not, because all the marketing teams seem to have missed it. And this is one of the biggest issues in Hollywood, and it always has been. It doesn't matter what the creator thinks when it comes to the money. If the big boys in the office think they're going to make a killing advertising it a certain way, then that's what they're going to do. Also, another thing that I think is important that I don't see people talk about as much is the posters. The posters of Crimson Peak are dreadful. For one of the most visually impressive and detailed films, why are the posters so boring? They have none of the atmosphere or the aesthetic of the movie, and they look just incredibly basic. And I think that might be on purpose, once again wanting it to appeal to the widest audience as possible rather than utilise that style and unique gothic flair. It's just everything. Everything about the marketing for this film set it up for failure, and it's such a shame because it's so good as a piece of gothic romance. Honestly, if you haven't seen Crimson Peak, I urge you to give it a go. It's not a groundbreaking, world-shattering piece of cinema, but it's a masterclass in style, atmosphere and genre. The way it deconstructs the typical Hollywood romance is just brilliant, and also Jessica Chastain is giving the campest performance ever, and that's just fun.
It's all a game to you!